hyperactivity can be about your brain moving quickly. Have you ever noticed with ADHD, like people are talking and you kind of already know what they're going to say? You're like, come on, come on, come on, come on, right? Like your brain is just going. You're already like 10 steps ahead of people in the conversation. Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. We've got a really fun episode planned for today. Just you and me this time, no guest. But I want to talk about something that I'm hearing a lot of questions about, a lot of commentary about in the people that I serve and from my email list, the circles. And I want to just take a full episode and really unpack ADHD in women, or maybe what it is to be ADHD adjacent, right? I have a lot of people sending me messages. Well, I'm not sure if I have ADHD, or I'm hearing comments from people. Well, I think I do. I struggle with these things. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge that confusion is hard. Like when you're struggling with functioning in the world, whatever is making that hard, that's tough, especially if you don't have a name for it or you don't feel like you fit in anywhere where people talk about this thing that you're struggling with. And that's tough, right? And I want to let you know that you're welcome here. My focus has been on ADHD women entrepreneurs, you don't have to be diagnosed with ADHD. You might be self-diagnosed, which would still be diagnosed in my opinion. Like you're like, oh yeah, I've totally got it, right? But maybe choose not to get the diagnosis for different reasons. And I can share more about that in a moment here. You might be ADHD adjacent where you're like, yeah, a lot of that fits, but I don't know, not all of it. I'm not really sure, but man, I sure get a lot out of some of the things you say, Jen. And you might be full-fledged, flaming ADHD, so neurodivergent, you can hardly stand it, right? Anywhere along that continuum is welcome, right? And so even if you're like, I don't have ADHD, but dang, I have a hard time getting myself to do stuff, or yeah, all my cell phone use over the years has made it really hard for me to focus, so you may get something out of that too. I also want to take a moment to talk about moving away from pathology. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we're currently on the 5th edition. Actually, I think a TR, a revised edition just came out, but we're currently on the 5th edition. And I want to say something about that. The DSM is what clinicians like me use to give people official diagnoses. And it becomes particularly important when people are wanting to use their insurance to bill for services. It also becomes particularly important when you need accommodations at school or work. Other than that, I kind of have some feelings about the DSM not really being all that helpful. And I have lots of reasons for it, but the main one is that almost all, but I don't want to misspeak, of the research that was done to create the DSM was done on men. Most likely hetero men, but for sure cisgendered white men. And so that DSM, that book of diagnoses for mental health stuff, really doesn't apply to the rest of us. And since I'm a woman and I work with women, I don't place a lot of stock in it. Also, as a trauma therapist, as an ADHD woman, a lot of the things that are in there stem directly from trauma or neurodivergence, which in my mind isn't a pathology, but our brains are just wired uniquely and in a way that is different from someone who doesn't have ADHD or autism or sensory processing disorder or whatever, right? And so while I understand sometimes it can feel nice to have an official diagnosis, I also want to name that like the criteria in the DSM are focused on what's wrong with you. And it's focused on what's wrong with you, pretty much putting you in the box of if you match symptoms of a white white cisgendered man or boy, right? And I'm not a fan of that model. First of all, like I said, it doesn't really apply to me or most of my clients. I mean, a little bit here and there, but like not great. But also, it doesn't look at the context of people's lives and what got them there, what influenced their brain to be a certain way, what got their behavior to be a certain way. And as we talk about what ADHD looks like in women, I want to unpack some of us having been diagnosed with anxiety and depression, but the root actually having been ADHD. So let's dig in. ADHD often looks very different in women and girls, especially those of us with inattentive type. I actually have hyperactive type. So let me break that down real quick. ADHD, by the way, very poorly named. It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. My problem with it is it said, first of all, the word deficit, attention deficit, like that doesn't make any sense because it's not that we can't pay attention. It's that our attention is inconsistent. So we can pay attention sometimes and other times we can't. We can particularly pay attention if something is interesting to us, something is a novelty, something it just grabs our attention. But if something is boring to us, we don't care about it, or it's become repetitive, whatever it is, it can be very hard to pay attention. So the word deficit in there with attention doesn't make any sense to me. The next piece of it that I have a hard time with is the word hyperactivity. Yes, most of our ADHD brains have one kind of hyperactivity or another, but a lot of times people are like, well, I don't have ADHD because I'm not hyperactive. The hyperactivity isn't necessarily about physical hyperactivity. The hyperactivity can be about your brain moving quickly. Have you ever noticed with ADHD, like people are talking and you kind of already know what they're going to say? You're like, come on, come on, come on, come on, right? Like your brain is just going. You're already like 10 steps ahead of people in the conversation. And it's not because you're rude or an asshole. It's just like that's what our brains do, right? They move very, very rapidly, more rapidly than your average neurotypical person, right? And that's not a dig on them. It's not a dig on us. It's just different, right? So all of us have hyperactivity. It just looks different. But a lot of times having that in the diagnosis just really messes up like just the ease of recognizing if you even have it. Lastly, the word disorder doesn't fit for me. This is not a disorder. Having ADHD does not mean that, I mean, this is not a pathology. This is not a problem. Yes, if you read the DSM criteria, it looks like you're messed up. It looks like something's wrong with you. But as I was recently reviewing the criteria, I was like, if we didn't have to live in the society that we live in the way it is, none of this would be a problem. It's just that society demands certain things. And so then we're considered dysfunctional. Whereas if we're allowed to do things our own unique ADHD way, yeah, we still have some challenges, but most of it stems around living in this world not designed for us. So I really want to talk about that or really lean into that because a lot of us feel so messed up with our ADHD, like we just can't do stuff. And sure, if you try and do things the neurotypical way, you're going to feel like you just can't do stuff. But as we step more and more into our own unique ADHD life, as we embrace it and we learn how to work with it, and we learn tools for the times when we do have to kind of comply with this neurotypical society or function in it in some way, we see that we're not like bad. A lot of us carry so much shame. And this is often one of the pieces, I wanted to talk about today, how ADHD looks different in women. And this is one of the big pieces. A lot of us weren't diagnosed when we were young because, when people say ADHD, almost everyone thinks of hyperactive boy because that's who got diagnosed. That's why we think of that. And that's really, when you look at the criteria, that's kind of what matches is hyperactive boy, can't sit still, right? And so a lot of us didn't get diagnosed. So instead, we just thought something was wrong with us. And even if you were diagnosed, you thought something was wrong with you, because the language of the DSM is very pathologizing. It, to be fair, it kind of has to be. In order for your insurance to pay for services, you have to have something wrong with you, right? We don't live in a wellness model in the United States. We live in a disease-based model. It's not a preventative model. So you don't actually get your help paid for until you have some kind of dysfunction, disorder, or problem, which is why I still use the DSM. I don't like it. I think it doesn't help people at all. I think it pathologizes things and makes people feel bad about themselves, when really it's just like life is hard and we all have different things that either happen to us, or ways of being, or the way our brain is, that maybe create some challenges with the way society is. But if you're looking at these criteria, you might feel like something's wrong with you if you were diagnosed. And even if you weren't diagnosed, you might even feel more so that something was wrong with you, and that because there's no name for it. So it's like, oh no, I'm just effed up, right? Like I can't do stuff, or I can't focus to save my life, or, oh, I'm a hot mess, right? Like we can have that kind of language instead of recognizing that, oh, my brain is different. And that is why I've struggled. It's not that I'm bad. It's that I just didn't know how to work with my brain yet. Right? So we women, because of this feeling like we're awful, often struggle. Our first signs of ADHD are anxiety and depression. And let me back up for a moment. I want to get back to that shame piece before I go into this next piece here. I read, oh my gosh, the book is called Extra Focus by Jesse J. I think his last name is Anderson. It might be Jackson, but I'm pretty sure it's Anderson. I'm hoping to have him on the podcast. We'll see. But anyway, in it, he talks about this pediatric psychiatrist, researcher kind of guy who made an estimate that was like a solid estimate that by the age of 10, kids with ADHD hear 20,000 more critical or corrective comments than their non-ADHD peers, right? And this was based on, this actually, I think, was kind of a conservative estimate, because it was based on getting 3 negative comments, criticism or corrective comments from a teacher every hour, right? Which is not unheard of for someone with ADHD, right? Pay attention, get your act together. We had a teacher who threw erasers at us. So I'm sure that counts, right? Like, anyway, Catholic school in the 80s. But anyway, that's a lot. 20,000 comments. And so is it really that crazy then that we would feel like something's wrong with us, or that we're bad, especially if we weren't diagnosed and didn't know what to do with it, right? If we had no idea that there was a thing that our brain was different because of, then we just felt like we were bad, which is what shame is. So a lot of times women with ADHD present with a lot of shame, especially if they're undiagnosed. And even people who were diagnosed present with shame. For those of us that were undiagnosed or have been late diagnosed, the first signs of it was probably anxiety and depression. Why? Well, all that negative commentary definitely wears down your self-esteem, lowers your mood, and your energy to do stuff is just, okay, you already struggle getting yourself to do stuff. And now everyone's telling you how worthless you are. So you're like, your motivation to do stuff isn't great. So depression is really common. Difficulty concentrating is another symptom of depression. So, that marries well with ADHD, because that's kind of one of the deals. But then the other piece of it is a lot of us present with anxiety, sometimes both, because when you're constantly being criticized, or you're in my case, I hyper functioned, right? Like I was like, oh my gosh, I perfectionism was real for me. I was like, I just got to keep my shit together. I got to do all this stuff. I've got to create these systems so that I didn't get in trouble, because I didn't want to get in trouble. So then we develop an anxiety disorder. And of course we did, because we're worried about being seen as less than, or getting in trouble, or being shamed, right? Shame was like the main go-to way of correcting kids when I was growing up. And that was just kind of the deal. And so some of us, out of fear of being in trouble, being punished, being shamed, We just worked extra hard to try and fight our ADHD, to mask it, to keep it together, and then developed an anxiety disorder. And some of us learned that anxiety, like procrastination, creates anxiety, right? Because then as we get closer to a task being due, we're like, oh my God, it's due tomorrow. Or maybe for you, it's like due in an hour or whatever it took. And then all of a sudden your fight or flight response kicks in. You get all that adrenaline and you're able to finish it, right? That's eventually anxiety. Like that's using anxiety to get yourself to do stuff. So a lot of us women present with anxiety disorders and depression, and that's what we get diagnosed with, which again, the word disorder, it's like, is it a disorder or was it a coping tool? To me, it was a coping tool. Is it legit anxiety? I don't even know if I believe anxiety exists outside of like anything else. I'm not sure. Even depression, I'm starting to question, like how much of this is, we had a traumatic upbringing, or we had undiagnosed ADHD or something else. In the 90s, everything was like, oh, well, depression is a chemical imbalance, right? But nowadays, a lot of us trauma therapists and people who work with ADHD were like, is it? I mean, sure, maybe there's a chemical imbalance, but what's the chicken and egg thing? Like, which came first? And I'm starting to think that perhaps, yeah, maybe we're more likely to get depression, or maybe we just got depressed because we were struggling with ADHD so long, right? So shame, anxiety, depression, low self-worth. That's something really common that we see with women with ADHD, as well as it can even look like OCD around your systems and around, keeping your shit together. Because, and I kind of present like that, right? Like I have all these systems that I use, and I've relaxed some as I'm like, okay, I can't mask as much as I used to. I just don't have the energy that I did when I was in my 20s and 30s, as I'm 49 here. And I had borderline OCD around my schedule and my routines and my systems, because if I don't do those things, my ADHD is all over the place, which I don't really care when it's just me. But when I am out in society, people have a problem with that, right? Because if you have ADHD, in conversation, we are total info dumpers, right? Someone asks how we are, and like 10 minutes later, we realize that we've been just talking and talking and talking. And that's not a great way to connect with people, right? So some of us have learned to mask and like try and catch ourselves and pause, because it's not that we're not interested in the other person. It's just that we kind of get into our info dump and we're like, oh yeah, wait, how are you? And then sometimes people feel offended. And so I can hold it together, whatever that means, in a conversation better by not info dumping, not blurting out or interrupting as much, if I've done my morning routine, if I've done my exercise, my meditation, a crap ton of yoga. Did I say morning writing? I don't remember if I did. Morning writing, meditation, exercise, yoga, all that stuff. If I do that, then I'm better able to kind of mask in conversation enough so that I can have an actual connection with someone who's not ADHD. Now, if you have ADHD and you're like, but how come some people aren't like that? So how come some people, we just, kind of talk in circles, we interrupt each other and nothing happens? Yeah, they also probably have ADHD. Right? When I'm talking, I can tell. I've got most of my clients in my private practice are ADHD. And I can always tell because our conversation is it just feels easier. And that's not like, saying anything negative about my clients who don't have ADHD. But there's just kind of this circular conversation that happens of interrupting each other and, listening, and then, oh yeah, or did you think about this, and circling back to things. And it's just how we do conversation. But no, neurotypical people don't do conversation that way. And so a lot of times we ADHDers get in trouble, or people don't like us, or they say we miss social cues, which we miss their social cues, but people who have ADHD, we catch their social cues all the time because we have the same ones. It's just that our brain is different, right? But that can be another way that ADHD shows up in women is we just do conversation differently. And so that circular kind of conversation with the interrupting and just keeping going. I did a phone chat with a fellow ADHDer not too long ago who is doing something similar with her business, helping ADHD women. And I don't know, we were like 20 minutes in the conversation. She just like exhaled. And she was like, "Oh, I can tell you're ADHD because conversation's so easy. Like, I noticed I just interrupted you and you just like kind of took in what I said and interwove it to the conversation and kept going." Right. And our conversation wasn't this big disruption. I wasn't annoyed at her. She wasn't annoyed at me because that's just how we do conversation. But what you might notice if you're talking to someone who doesn't have ADHD, they might get irritated by you or feel like you're interrupting them or that you're impolite or that you're blurting out or that there's no space in the conversation for them when really you're just waiting for them to jump in when they have something to say. So is it really that you're dysfunctional or is it that you just have a different way of relating to people? Yeah. Right. So this episode is turning out to be what ADHD looks like in women and how it's not a disorder, I guess. So we're just going to roll with it in true ADHD fashion. Yeah. Other things you're going to notice with ADHD is trouble staying organized in the same way other people do, right? We've all heard about the ADHD pile or piles, plural, where we have just piles of stuff everywhere. And that tends to come from our brains needing things to be in sight, otherwise they're out of mind. But the problem is, I find if my piles get too big and unattended to for too long, then I completely don't even see that pile anymore and forget it's there. And so sometimes we can use a system in there, which is what I do in my work with clients, is figuring out like what systems do we actually need and what systems are actually driving us crazy towards some kind of perfectionistic neurotypicality, a word I apparently have made up now. Right. So struggling with organization, if you struggle to find things or you're losing things, that could be ADHD. Especially coupled with all this other stuff. Maybe you noticed you forget things. Our working memory is different than the working memory of someone who doesn't have ADHD. Right? So sometimes like someone will tell me their name and then we'll talk and I'll completely forget it. So if someone tells me their name, I have to say it back to them. And then immediately in my brain, I have to link it with, Jen, blue shirt. I'm wearing a blue shirt right now. Dana, nose ring, like it's just like, okay, because that way my brain actually like it's almost like an anchor in the conversation that I remember their name. And then I have to say their name at the end of our conversation too, or it's totally gone. And the other thing is, I'm going to tell you, I've just gotten comfortable with recognizing that it's more important for me to remember people's names than it is to be embarrassed about having to ask for it again when I've forgotten. It sounds like a horrible thing to have to do, but I want to tell you, especially if you do this early on, people actually value when we say, you know what, it is really important to me to remember your name. I just don't remember it. Would you please help me? And if you've gone too long and you didn't ask, probably someone would appreciate it because they might know on some level you don't actually know their name. But like they would probably appreciate if you said, okay, look, I never learned your name. And now I've known you too long to ask your name, so it's embarrassing. But would you please help me with what your name is so I can actually call you by your name? Because I'd rather look like a fool right now in this moment and be able to call you by your name than like just not know it. Most people get that. And if they don't, I don't know. Like you get to decide what you want to do with that friendship or that acquaintanceship or whatever's going on there, right? Like it's an honest mistake that people make, especially with ADHD. Yeah. So certainly being forgetful, struggling to hold things in our memory. This isn't supposed to be a tips and tricks kind of podcast episode, but I will share something that helps me remember stuff. And I thought this was weird. I thought I was the only one who did it until the Jesse person I mentioned it in his book, Extra Focus. So for years, If I need to remember something, like if I needed to remember something right now, my mouse is right here. I would put my mouse here because now it's in a weird spot. And then later I'd be like, why did I put that mouse there? And then I hook it with what I need to remember, right? Like I should probably look up Jesse's name, put it in the show notes because I've mentioned his book a few times, right? And so that is something that I'll want to remember. And so I would put something out of place. You know, a lot of times if I'm in bed, I would throw a sock on the floor because a sock isn't in the middle of the floor for me. And if you're like, Jen, I have socks everywhere. Okay, well, then that's not going to be your thing. Like, it just might not be your thing. Because that's the other thing is as we're working on understanding our ADHD or what might be ADHD or what might be ADHD adjacent, I want to tell you, we've got to figure out how to do things in a way that works for us. It's time to give up the old narrative that we have to function like everyone else. It's just not going to happen. And really, should anyone in the world really function exactly the same as anyone else? I'm going to go with no. Like, no one is exactly the same, not even identical twins. Identical twins often have like completely different personalities, right? Sometimes they have similarities, but I was married to an identical twin, not very long. He was a good man, but just not marriage was not my jam. Anyway, and he and his brother had totally different personalities. They looked the same, although after a while they looked similar to me, not the same. If you've been around an identical twin, you know that, but their personalities were different. So my point is no two people in the world are exactly the same. So none of us should be doing everything exactly the same. And if you have ADHD, you definitely shouldn't be doing things. I don't want to say shouldn't, like I'm shaming, but like it's not going to be effective for you to do things the exact same way neurotypical people in your life do them. Not because the way they do it is bad. No, it's because the way they do it works for them, but that doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So working with your ADHD is about finding what works for you. All right, back on the rails. Whenever I talk about ADHD, it's like my ADHD symptoms flare. It's like, oh, we're going to be ADHD right now. Let's do it. Right. So hopefully you're still with me. Does anyone else have that? Yeah, right. Okay. So one of the things I talked about was some of us, as a way to compensate for our ADHD, is we develop this massive structure or self-care routine or systems that we have to abide by that to keep us in line, right? So we're not in trouble, right? And if you find yourself not having any free time because you're either working or you're taking care of your ADHD, then that's still ADHD, right? When I first got diagnosed or assessed rather, when I was 29, funny story, I worked with other social worker types at the time as a case manager, and everyone was like convinced I had ADHD, right? There's a long story that goes along with it. But anyway, I won't unpack that here. That's in one of my first episodes where I share about, I think it was heavily masked and highly anxious or something. So you can go back and listen to that story. But so I went and got assessed and I didn't meet criteria because I was told that I was functioning too well and that I had all these amazing coping tools and systems. So there's no way I could have it. And I'm like, or I have it and my whole life is dedicated to functioning with it. Right? This is another reason I have a problem with the DSM. Right? And so if this is you, if you're like having to overfunction just to be able to live in this world, that doesn't mean you don't have ADHD. It means you do. That's just another way it manifests, especially in women, because the bar is higher for us. Growing up female, when we're trying to compete for jobs with men in this very male-dominated patriarchal society, we have to have our shit together better than men. At least my generation did. I'm a Gen Xer. I don't know about your generation. So that meant having to have perfectionism and work extra hard. Now, if you have super severe ADHD or also have complex trauma, like you lived in a horrible, like just where there was a lot of abuse in your home, a lot of verbal, emotional abuse can be what it was. It could also be physical or sexual abuse or other abuse, neglect If you had that going on, then maybe you couldn't figure out how to get all these systems in place. And that doesn't mean you're bad. It just means your resilience tub was full. You didn't have any more, you didn't have more spoons or resources to be able to get yourself to function in this neurotypical world, right? So maybe you struggled in school instead of got straight A's and overfunctioned and masked your ADHD by high achievement, right? Hi, that was me. I masked my ADHD by high achievement, but not everyone can do that because your environment, the tools that you had, the resources you had may have been different, and your ADHD might have been more severe. Yeah. So you might find yourself on one end or the other, like you just can't get yourself to do structure, or you're so crazily structured you can't even enjoy life. So it can look like that in women. Something else that I didn't know was ADHD until recently, I didn't know that the neurotypical brain didn't do this, is that everything is a process. And I did a TikTok on it, and I was like, whoa, like it exploded because apparently this is a thing that I've only known as a thing for like, I don't know, like 6 months now, maybe. Everything for our ADHD brain is a process. We have to think through every single step, right? So, for example, this morning, I got up, I went through my morning routine, but I didn't have my lemon water. I didn't have a lemon to make lemon water. And so I was like, oh, I'm out of order. And so because I was out of the order of sequence I do things, I didn't have the environmental trigger of like, okay, I just put the clean dishes from the drying rack away. Now I do my lemon water, but then what comes next, right? So I had to think it through. It was a process. I'm like, oh yeah, okay. Now I make my happy digestion tea, right? Like, so now I do that and okay. And then I start my coffee and then I feed the cats, right? But I had to like think through what the process was, right? Because I was skipping a step, then the process changes. Apparently other people like who don't have ADHD just go in the kitchen in the morning and do what they need to do. Like they just know. They don't have to think through the steps. Because even when I have my lemons for lemon water, I'm still on some level thinking through the steps. I do it in a certain order every day, so I don't have to waste as much brain power on it, but there still is thinking involved in like, oh, okay, I'll do this and then I'll do this, right? Especially if there's any variation at all, right? Like maybe I left 2 dishes in the sink to soak instead of just the frying pan, right? And so apparently this is really common for women with ADHD. It's not everybody. Like, remember, all these things aren't necessarily like, oh, if you don't have all of them, that means you don't have ADHD. These are just some of the ways it manifests. And one of them is everything is a process that you have to think through. It's why a lot of neurodivergent folks do a lot of the same things. I pretty much eat the same thing every night. Now I vary it a little bit, but I pretty much almost always have some kind of pasta with a bunch of veggies stir fried in some kind of sauce. And then I have a couple other meals I can do, like a veggie burger, or like I can make a really good egg sandwich, or I can make like a grilled quote unquote cheese. I don't have cheese because I can't have dairy, but like, with like vegan bacon on it and stuff, right? Like, or I can do mac and cheese, not real cheese, or pizza or tacos, but I pretty much eat almost the same thing every night. Why? Because it's less thinking through the steps. If I just get into a sequence of doing it, then I can do it faster and waste less time. And time wasting is real for us. I think a lot of us ADHDers worry about wasting time because we use our time inefficiently a lot of the times because we have a hard time focusing. And some of that is because we haven't learned how to follow our natural energy and go with what task is most suited for the moment. If you're wondering more about that, listen to the previous podcast episode with Sally Crew, where we talk about that. Oh my gosh, it was an amazing conversation. So happy about that one. But some of the reason we are trying to conserve energy is because we can be so inefficient with our energy. Some of it is just no matter how hard we try, things take us longer. So we're always trying to find ways to shave time and save time, right? That's why some of us wear the same outfits over and over and over again because it's just easier, right? Or the same pair of earrings or whatever. So if you're catching yourself doing a lot of that sameness, sure. Now, some of that can be autism too, right? There's a lot of overlap. I want to touch on that for a moment. There's a ton of overlap between ADHD and autism. You can look, there's like Venn diagrams all over the internet. If you just look for Google Venn diagram on overlap between ADHD and autism, they're super overlapped. What I actually think will happen, and this is just my hypothesis, I haven't tested this, it's going to become one diagnosis. And then we're just going to be somewhere on a bigger spectrum. It's just, or not even just like a sphere, and we all kind of are in different circles. That just seems more appropriate. But for now, just know that there's overlap there, and doing things the same in patterns can be one of them. It doesn't necessarily mean you're autistic. It might mean that you've learned to do that to cope with your ADHD, and now you're kind of a little obsessive about it, because if you don't do it, then you fall apart and you're a big hot mess. Anyone else? Yeah. It sure looks autistic though. And I don't know, maybe it is. Maybe it's all the same. That's kind of what I think. Another thing that you might notice as a woman with ADHD is time blindness. Time blindness is our brains just do time differently. We don't see time the same way the neurotypical brain does. I don't have my time timer with me, so I can't show you, but you might remember, like in classrooms, they would have it was like big and red, like it showed visual time progressing through an hour. And those time timers are super helpful for people with ADHD. Why? Our brain doesn't think about time the same way. And I'll give you two examples. One, I was talking to my neighbor who has ADHD about goblin.tools, which, oh my gosh, if you haven't done that deep dive yet, amazing, so cool. But I was talking about the function where you can type in how long something will take and it'll tell you. And I was like, you can type in how long will it take to clean my cat's litter boxes, and it tells you, I don't know, like 15 minutes. And she's like, no, because I would look at that and be like, I can do that faster. And I was like, totally. Yes, our brains do that. We don't believe in time the same way. We think we can do things faster. Like another example is this is crazy to me and hilarious because I have awareness of it, but this is how my brain works. So one day I was getting ready in the morning. I was doing my morning routine. And I was doing Zumba. And at that time, the Zumba class had a song at the end that was like a 5-minute arm challenge song, right? Where we did all this movement with our, dancing with our arms mostly. It felt kind of like belly dancing-ish. But anyway, and it was 5 minutes. And I knew it was 5 minutes because I'd done it several times for a couple months, right? And it was like, I had to get in the shower at 10 after the hour. And it was 6 minutes after the hour. And she comes on and she's like, okay, we're going to do our 5-minute arm challenge. Now, mind you, after I do the 5-minute arm challenge, I still need to stretch, right? So we're talking 5 minutes plus at least 5 minutes to stretch or do some yoga, maybe even another 5. So it could have been 10 to 15 minutes is what I needed. And it was 6 after the hour. And she said, yep, we're going to do our 5-minute arm challenge. And I was like, oh, I totally can squeeze that in. Okay, now do the math. Even if I'm super conservative with how much time I need, let's say I wasn't even going to stretch, 6 plus 5 is 11. So cognitively, I was like, I don't actually have time for this. I cognitively don't, but my ADHD brain kept going, no, you could totally squeeze it in. That's insane, right? And so that's what time blindness is. We think, oh, I'll just do this real quick. But the reality is real quick is way longer than we think it's going to be. This is why a lot of us women with ADHD tend to run late, because we think we're just going to squeeze something in real quick. We don't like unused time for the reasons I mentioned before, right? We have a hard enough time getting stuff done that we tend to try and be really efficient with our time. At least some of us do, maybe not everyone. That's why I have a book everywhere. And it's why a lot of us have our phones everywhere. Right? We don't want to have unused time because it's so valuable, because we struggle with using it efficiently. And so a lot of times, because of our time blindness, we're going to squeeze stuff in that we just don't have time for. So if you catch yourself running late a lot to things, that could be what's going on, versus you just being lazy or not caring about other people's time, right? That's the assumption people make, is that you don't value their time or you don't care about them. It has nothing to do with it. It's not about them. It tends to be about like how our brains work. And we're like, oh, real quick, I'm just gonna do this. How many times have you said that to yourself? It's absolutely ridiculous how often we say it to ourselves, and it's never real quick, right? Like, never have I done that and still been on time. Anyone else? So time blindness is real. It's something to really think about. All right. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into the social issue because, I talked a little bit about how people interrupt us or view our interrupting as problematic or view our info dumping as problematic. And really, it's only problematic when we're talking with neurotypical people because most neurodivergent people talk the same way, although not necessarily autistic people. So, some of it is navigating the friendship. And I'm not saying, when we're in relationship with people, we can choose to try to mask some of that because we care about them, right? I have some neurotypical friends and I care about them. They're really good people. And, so when I'm in conversation with them, though, to actually be able to have a conversation with them, I do have to kind of wait my turn a little more. And it does take a lot of energy to do. And so it's a different kind of relationship because I definitely am having to like, okay, wait your turn. Okay. You can share about what's going on, but like put a stopwatch on. So like if it's a phone conversation, so that way you remember like they have a turn too. And then if you want to interrupt, I quick write a note about like what I was going to want to say. Or if I'm in live conversation with someone, I'll do this with my finger because I'll almost always remember to do that. Or I'll literally put my fingers over my mouth to keep myself from talking if I'm really struggling that day. Anyone else? It's just me. Like I do this intentionally, but maybe you catch yourself doing it. You're like, oh, maybe that's why I do that. Right. So for sure, in our social interactions, especially if you're not an entrepreneur listening to this, or maybe you still have a job, but you're working on being an entrepreneur, but you still have a job while you're building your business. Sometimes our coworkers are going to be neurotypical, and to get along with our coworkers, we might need to learn to do some of these skills. They're going to see us as missing social cues. They're going to see us as interrupting and blurting out. And that's what the DSM says for ADHD. For us, it's just how we talk. And we certainly, depending on the relationship, can teach them that this is how we do. And hey, sometimes I'm going to interrupt, and feel free to interrupt me back and say, hey, I wasn't finished. Right. But we can work with them on it. Some environments, it's not going to be okay to do that. And we're just going to have to, if we want to have a relationship with that person, like a working relationship, sometimes we're going to have to learn how to not interrupt and take turns in conversation a little bit more than we already do. Right. I'm not saying it's fair. You can certainly be of the view that like, I'm tired of having to always learn the neurotypical way of acting. I just want to be neurodivergent. It's their turn to learn. And hey, if that's your jam, totally go for it. I also know for some of us, that's not realistic. So it's just kind of navigating whatever you need to navigate at whatever point you have in your life. But you might find that over time, as you step more and more into your ADHD and create your own ADHD life that is unique to you, including having your own business the way that you want to have it, you may find that you just automatically have less neurotypical people in your life because you're just not attracting them to you. And again, they're not bad. It's just our brains are different. And sometimes it can take more effort when we're interacting with each other. Almost as though like, I remember a little bit of German from when I learned German in high school. I could certainly try to talk German with someone. It might be hard. I'd probably be saying like etwas langsamer bitte, which means a little slower, please, constantly, or going, I don't know what you're saying in English. The same is true with ADHD. It's just a different kind of communication. And so we can certainly like do the translation in our head, or we can help people work on the translation with us. Yeah. All right. Another piece about the social challenges that I want to talk about is rejection sensitive dysphoria. And I'm not going to lie, when this first kind of came out as a thing, I was like, oh, for crying out loud, that's not even a symptom. Right? Because I was still kind of tied to the DSM diagnosis. This was several years ago now. But RSD is real. people with ADHD really do feel or really are extra sensitive to rejection. I actually think I know what this might be about. I have a hypothesis. This hasn't been studied, but this makes a lot of sense to me. So see what you think. I think because we've gotten all that extra criticism. Remember, 20,000 extra comments is, I mean, it's an estimation still, but like possibly 20,000 extra critical comments or corrective comments to us by the time we're 10, right? That wears on a person. To me, I think that is like could be viewed as trauma. Some of us might experience it as traumatic, right? Especially if it hits our self-worth. But of course, we're going to be sensitive to rejection if every time we're just doing our ADHD thing, we're criticized for it or corrected, right? So, yeah, what if, rejection sensitive dysphoria is more just about like, we're just like overburdened with people criticizing us all the time or being annoyed with our ADHD and then not seeing it's our ADHD. So they're annoyed with us. And so then we get sensitive to it because it triggers our past history of being criticized too much. Thoughts? I'd love to hear your comments about that. That's my hypothesis. I don't know that it's necessarily profound, but I think that's what's going on, right? I think it's certainly a trigger when we get criticized. And I think that's why a lot of times it can be so hard to let that stuff go. I still remember, this is embarrassing, but I still remember this was in 2017 or 2018. I'm pretty sure it was 2018. I know my mom was still alive and I was still in Colorado Springs. So I'm going with 2018. I was leaving a parking lot and I was on the right-hand side because I was going to turn right. I was at a stop sign and I was stopped. Going to go right. A guy was turning left into the parking lot with his windows down and sunroof open. And he goes, "Watch what you're doing, bitch," to me. And I still feel like a little twinge in my gut. I wasn't even doing anything wrong. I was stopped at the stop sign. And even if I was going to turn, he was coming into the parking lot. Like it doesn't make sense. Like we weren't going to hit each other anyway. But that hurt. And I had a super hard time letting it go. It took me several days, right? Whereas, my mom always used to say, "Gosh, Jen, just let it go. Like, it's fine. I wish you could just let stuff go." And my brain just can't. I mean, I've learned to work on it and, recognize there's a part of me that holds this and that comment wasn't about us and everything. But I really feel like it's a lot more work for us ADHDers to let go of stuff like that. And I truly believe it's because of all the criticism that we face, so much more than someone who doesn't have ADHD. Yeah. To me, it's trauma, right? To me, it's trauma. Think about it. If you're constantly being criticized for just how you are, how your brain is, how you function, and told that you're doing it wrong, that wears on a person. That wears, right? And whether you want to use the trauma word or not, there's a wound there, a wound that we need to heal, right? So I talk more about how to work with that. Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga is a nice one. It's one that I offer through this business because it doesn't require one-on-one work, right? I'll just give a little side plug. TCTSY, Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga, is an evidence-based protocol for complex trauma and PTSD. It also helps with anxiety. And there's so many studies on it now that continue to show really positive results. And if you can always go to traumasensitiveyoga.com and then go to their resources page. It's under research. There's all that research there, but it's a really lovely protocol. And what it does is it helps us build a sense of agency, an ability to see kind of what we want, know what we want, and make a choice and then go follow through on it, which I think is fantastic for ADHD. Even if we don't think we have trauma, I think that's fantastic for us anyway. But it also works on interoception, which is another thing I want to talk about relative to ADHD. Interoception is the ability to notice our internal cues and to connect with them. Trauma survivors really struggle with interoception. Why? Because they had to learn not to trust what was going on inside and do something different out here in order to be safe. Not too different from someone who's trying to avoid getting criticized with ADHD. No? I actually think this might be why we have interoceptive issues versus it being something about how our brains are. I actually think it's more because we have this trauma. But whatever it is, we know that many people with ADHD have a hard time noticing what's going on. Like you might work for hours when you're hyper focused, not even notice you're hungry and have to go to the bathroom. And then you get up and you almost pee your pants because you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't go to the bathroom for like 5 hours. It's not happened to anyone else. Or you get up and you're dizzy and you're like, oh my gosh, I haven't eaten since this morning. Yeah. It's because we're not noticing our internal signals, or we might not notice pain. We might not notice things like that. And for some people, this gets way more severe, especially with complex trauma, and especially, some of my clients who have really extreme childhood trauma and torture in there. They don't notice, significant pain. They don't notice being cold ever or hot. So there can be definitely those kind of more extreme examples, but some of it is just even notice basic needs, noticing when we're uncomfortable in a situation, right? Like we've shut that down. So we might not notice that we're uncomfortable. We might not hear our body's internal messages about like, oh, this conversation is really uncomfortable for me. I want to get out of it. So trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga actually builds interoception. And we know this, the science of it. Some of it has to do with what's called the insular cortex in your brain. And by building that, it builds this ability to turn inward. Yeah. So anyway, just kind of fun TCTSY fact, but it's a great way to deal with some of this trauma and help with ADHD symptoms, because it does deal with some of that loss of a sense of agency, as well as difficulty with interoception, difficulty with hearing those cues. All right. So I want to just kind of take a moment. I've gone through a lot. I think there's two big things that I haven't talked about yet. And one is task avoidance. I mean, I kind of talked about this, right? I kind of talked about procrastination. But our brain is interest focused. Our attention is interest based, right? So we can easily pay attention to something that interests us, something that's a novelty, but it can be hard to pay attention to things that aren't interesting or where the novelty has worn off. And so a lot of times people think, oh, you can tell us, you can pay attention here, but you can't pay attention here. You must not care. And it's actually not true. Our brains can't do that. And the neuromodulator dopamine actually has something to do with this. Our ADHD brains, they don't have access to as much dopamine as the neurotypical brain does, which is problematic because dopamine plays a role in motivation. And there's a whole big, long thing we could unpack about dopamine. There's a fantastic podcast episode that the Huberman Lab did, Dr. Andrew Huberman did. He's a neuroscientist who breaks down this stuff really, really well, gets really granular about the science, about how we have this baseline level of dopamine, and every once in a while our dopamine will spike or peak. And then when it peaks, that can actually make our baseline go low. And so we want to do things to kind of keep our dopamine baseline at a certain level and not just randomly spike it with these dopamine peaks all the time, because it can actually longer term make it hard for us to get ourselves to do stuff. It can make motivation harder, which makes sense, right? We're like, oh, I just need that dopamine hit. I need a dopamine hit. Yeah, okay, maybe you think you need a dopamine hit right now, but then that's going to be a peak so that your baseline will drop. So what you actually need is like a nice level dopamine baseline. And sure, it's going to spike from time to time, but you also want to make sure you're having a level dopamine, like a baseline. Some of how we do that is we do things regularly that help our dopamine. For me, that's exercise. Exercise helps a lot, right? And this could be a whole nother episode, so I'll unpack that later. But I do want to talk about motivation, right? A lot of us really struggle with getting ourselves to do things, and motivation is certainly a piece of it. Dopamine is also involved in other attentional things as well. So like I said, novelty and things being interesting. And so certainly how our dopamine plays a role in all this, but that gets more into like what we do. And right now I just want to talk more about what ADHD looks like. So if you're having a hard time getting yourself to do stuff, that's really, really common, especially if it's something that's not interesting to you. Like I talked about with Sally Crew on our last episode, one thing we can do is pay attention to our energy levels. So if your energy level is a certain way, then you need to focus on certain tasks. This happened to me this past Thursday. I was so excited. And if you're on my email list in my email club, you know this. But I was so excited to record this podcast episode on Thursday. Usually I record on Thursday. Today's Saturday here where I'm recording. And I was so excited and I was ready to do this content for my program for the women in my ADHD Women Entrepreneurs Kicking Ass program. And I was all pumped. I went to the eye doctor. It was actually good news. My eyes didn't change, which is awesome news when you're 49 and you have which is like bifocals, except they progress, I guess. I don't know. If you're an ophthalmologist or optometrist, I apologize if I messed that up. But anyway, I'm neither of those things. So that's how my non-eye doctor brain sees it. But anyway, it's good news, right? I had good news. So then why all of a sudden did I lose my focus? I have no idea. It felt kind of people-y being there. I visited with the person who was doing my stuff because I'm very social, even though I'm an introvert. I came home and I had zero energy to do my creation stuff, which is my favorite thing to do on Thursdays. And I was so bummed. And I was like, you know what? Old Jen would have fought it. I would have been like, nope, we're going to do it anyway. But then it would have felt forced. And you would have known it. It would have felt forced. It wouldn't have come from my heart. I wouldn't have been excited like I am right now. So I was like, all right, what do I have energy for? And I went and did that. And then I actually had a little bit more energy later in the day to do some of the creation tasks, not the podcast. That has to be a morning thing for me. I just, for whatever reason, probably because it's closest to my exercise, right? So, but anyway, and yoga. But anyway, one of the ways we can work with our motivation is to try and notice our energy levels. And instead of shaming ourselves when we can't do stuff, to just go with it, to work with what we have, right? So if you're feeling motivated to clean something, then clean it. Now, granted, if you're running late somewhere, that is not the time to clean it, right? One of my tricks for getting out the door on time is when I get off task, when I'm trying to get ready, is I chant to myself, is this a priority? No, that's not a priority. This is not a priority right now. That is not a priority right now. My priority is this. My priority is this. My priority is this. If I'm finding myself getting distracted, right? That distraction is so common with ADHD. And so if you're like, oh my gosh, I totally get distracted, that's a real thing. But yeah, getting back to motivation, you want to follow your energy levels, and not even energy level, but energy type. Like we talked about with Sally, that's really important. Being highly distractible is common with ADHD. I mean, everyone's like, oh, squirrel, right? Like that's kind of the ADHD joke. Our brains are squirrely. They move so quickly, which is why in conversation, like I said before, we're already like 5 steps ahead of a conversation than someone else who's neurotypical, which is sometimes what makes us struggle in those conversations. So our brains move really, really fast. And we notice it's not that we actually are tuned out. It's not that we're not noticing anything. It's that we're noticing everything. And that's why we can be so inattentive, is our brain sees everything. We have a hard time filtering out what to pay attention to and what to discard. So if you're having a hard time focusing, if you're having a hard time of avoiding distraction, know that you come by that honestly. That's how your brain is. Our brains are wired to look for all that stimuli. And so working with ADHD is figuring out like when can we harness that and when do we need to shift it? Yeah. All right. Couple more things. Definitely we can be impulsive. It's part of our ADHD brain. I think some of that, like, I don't know. This is again a hypothesis, not a tested theory. But I think like some of our impulsivity is we don't want to forget. Like we know we forget things. So when we have an idea, it's like has to happen right now. Otherwise we'll forget to do it. If we have an idea, something we want to bring it up in a conversation, something we want to bring up in a conversation, we're like, oh my gosh, I have to say this right now, right? Or I'll forget. So I think some of our impulsivity can be tied to that, as well as how fast our brains move because they move on quickly. So if we don't say it or think it or do it when we're thinking it, then it's gone, right? Or if we don't do something when we feel like we want to do it, then we're going to lose our motivation, which is, I think, why we have this impulsivity going on. I think it's all tied in. I think it all works together to try to get us to function the best we can in this neurotypical society. Yeah. I started talking about task avoidance, and I don't know that I finished, but I think I said enough about it. I know I talked about procrastination, and I know I talked about following your energy levels. But a lot of times we avoid tasks that are uninteresting to us. And so if I didn't say that before, I just wanted to name that we come by that honestly. And so I hope what you'll take away from this, instead of listing off all the things that are wrong with you, because that's not true, these are just the ways that your brain might be different than someone who doesn't have ADHD. And you might be like, wow, Jen, a lot of that fits, but a lot of it really doesn't. Yeah, maybe you're ADHD adjacent. And I guess to me, why does it matter? Yeah, I called my program ADHD Women Entrepreneurs Kicking Ass. I did that. I don't care if you have ADHD or not and you're in my program. If you are struggling with a lot of these things and you are in some way in business for yourself, whether you sell stuff on the side of your job or you're retired and you have a little business, whatever, if you're struggling to do things, struggling to pay attention, like I'm not checking for diagnosis. I only use the word ADHD to help people. Otherwise, the title would have been like program for people struggling to get stuff done, focus interpersonally with shame. I mean, the label catches all the stuff. But if a lot of this is fitting for you, you're welcome here. You're welcome to be here. You get to belong in this space. And you get to use some of these tools and discard what doesn't fit, discard what doesn't resonate. But I hope the biggest takeaway that you get out of this is that you're not messed up, that these are just ways that your brain works. And some of it is some of the challenges stem from your brain trying to figure out how to function in our current society as it is. And that the best thing you can do for yourself, instead of shaming yourself, is to figure out how can you live, how can you set up your life in a way that aligns with your brain's unique needs, ADHD or not, diagnosed or not, self-diagnosed, ADHD adjacent. How can you keep in mind all these different challenges and set up your life to work for you? How can you honor these unique differences in you instead of shaming yourself for them? How can you work with them? How can you harness them for your benefit? And then how can you give yourself a break when you feel bad that you can't get yourself to do something because of these challenges, because of these ways of being that maybe don't fit into the world as it is right now? All right. It's some stuff to think about. It's so great to have you here. Thank you so much for listening. Please share something in the comments about anything that really struck you today. I would love it if you did. Also, be sure to follow and subscribe if you're not already. And I would love it if you would share. All right, everyone. Take care.